Homeless veteran returned a lost MC patch. Then 200 bikers went silent. There were 200 men and women in that parking lot, and not one of them made a sound. That's the thing that stays with you when people who are there try to describe it. Not the moment before, not the moment after. The silence itself. 200 bikers, engines off, the parking lot of the Iron Riders clubhouse on a Saturday morning in October, cold enough to see breath, and not one sound. No one coughing, no one shifting their weight, no one speaking. They were looking at a man standing at the edge of the lot. He was thin. That's the first thing anyone noticed, though they wouldn't say it first when they tried to describe him later, the way you don't lead with the thing that makes you feel guilty. He was thin in the way that tells you it wasn't a choice. He was wearing a jacket that had been the right size for someone else in a different decade. His boots were wrapped at the left toe with a strip of silver duct tape that had gone gray. He had a beard that had grown past intention into something that just existed, and eyes that had the particular quality of a man who has learned to take inventory of a room very quickly because his survival had depended on it, because it still did. In his hands, he held something. He held it the way you hold something that isn't yours, carefully, with a kind of deliberate respect that comes from understanding the value of what you're carrying without understanding all the reasons for that value. He held it at arm's length, slightly away from his body, the way you'd carry a live coal. It was a leather patch, the back patch of the Iron Riders MC, chapter president, hand-stitched border, the name Bobby stitched in red thread across the nameplate. The patch that had belonged to Robert Calloway, president of the Iron Riders for 14 years, who had died 8 months ago on a Tuesday in February when his heart simply stopped, the way hearts sometimes do, without warning, without ceremony, without enough time to say the things you meant to say. The patch had been lost at his funeral. Nobody knew how. Nobody had been able to find it. It was the kind of loss that sits on top of a greater loss and makes the greater loss somehow worse, the way specific grief accumulates. And now a homeless man was standing at the edge of their parking lot holding it. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. 200 people breathing the cold air of an October morning, and the only sound was the distant highway and one crow somewhere in the tree line, and a man named Marcus Webb standing very still with Bobby Calloway's patch in his hands, waiting to see what happened next. He'd been waiting for this moment for 4 months. He'd walked 11 miles to get here. And this is where the story actually starts. Not in the parking lot, not in the silence, but much further back, in a place most of you have never been, and most of you will never go, and in a war that ended officially, but never really ended for the people who fought it. Marcus David Webb was born in 1981 in Shreveport, Louisiana, the second of 4 children, the son of a woman named Gloria, who worked dispatch for a trucking company, and a man named Gerald, who drove truck and came home on weekends and smelled like diesel and distance. He was, by all accounts, the kind of kid who doesn't make trouble but finds it anyway. Not mean, not cruel, just alive in the particular, restless way of boys who have too much energy for the spaces available to them. He was good at school when he paid attention, which was when the subject interested him, which was not always. He was good with his hands, in the way that some people are, instinctively, without instruction. He could fix the lawnmower at 12, rewired a lamp at 13, took apart and reassembled the family's second-hand television at 15, just to see if he could, and then put it back together when his mother came home and it worked better than it had before. He joined the Army at 19 because it seemed like the thing that made sense. He was honest about this later, in the years when he had therapists who asked him to be honest about things. He hadn't joined out of patriotism exactly, or not only out of patriotism. He joined because the structure appealed to him, because something in him craved the clarity of it. This is the mission. These are the people beside you. This is what matters. Do it well. He was good at it. He did 2 tours in Iraq, 2003 to 2004, 2005 to 2006. He was a staff sergeant by his second tour. His men, the ones who served under him, would tell you later, would tell you without being asked, that he was the best NCO they'd ever had. Not because he was easy, he wasn't easy. He was precise and demanding, and he had standards that he enforced without apology and without cruelty, which is rarer than it sounds. He was the kind of soldier who remembered your kids' names and your girlfriend's name and your mother's name and asked about them, not as a management technique, but because he actually wanted to know. He came home in 2006. He came home wrong. That's not his word. His word was different in those early years when he could talk about it at all. He said off. He said sideways. He said like the ground under everything had shifted 3 degrees and nobody else could feel it but him. The clinical word came later, after the diagnosis, after the paperwork, after the long, grinding process of trying to get the VA to acknowledge that what the war had done to him was real and documentable and deserving of treatment. PTSD, traumatic brain injury from a blast event in 2005 that he'd been told at the time was minor. Depression, anxiety of the specific, hypervigilant variety that made it very difficult to be in any room with more than 4 or 5 people without his nervous system treating the room as a hostile environment. He tried, for about 4 years, to be normal. He had a job as a mechanic, made sense, he was good with his hands, and he was good at the job until the shop got busy and the noise got loud, and he had a week where he didn't sleep more than 3 hours any night, and on a Friday afternoon he told his supervisor something he shouldn't have said, in a tone he shouldn't have used, and lost the job. He found another, lost it, found another. He had a relationship with a woman named Diane that lasted 2 years and ended not because she stopped caring, but because she couldn't reach him, and they both knew it, and pretending otherwise was making them both worse. He moved around, Shreveport to Houston to Memphis to Atlanta, looking for something he couldn't name. Cheaper rent, a fresh start, whatever the thing is that people are looking for when they move every 8 months. He ended up in Mill Haven, North Carolina in 2014, which is where this story takes place, though it takes 10 more years to get to the part you're here for, and those 10 years matter. Because without them, you don't understand the man standing in that parking lot with the patch in his hands. Mill Haven is not a city. It's a town of about 12,000, the kind of place that has a hardware store that's been there since 1962, and a diner that hasn't changed its menu since 1987, and a main street with several businesses that are doing fine, and several that aren't, and a general quality of holding on that most American towns of its size have in common. Marcus got there by accident. He was passing through on a Thursday, planning to keep going, and his truck broke down on the highway 6 miles out of town. And by the time he got it sorted, the afternoon was gone. And something about the town, he couldn't have told you what exactly, made him stay. He found a room at a weekly motel, got a day labor job at a construction site, stayed a week, then another. He was there for 3 years before things went sideways the second time. He won't go into specifics, and you don't need them. What you need is this. The system that was supposed to help him didn't help him, not in the ways that mattered, not in time. The paperwork got lost. The appointment got canceled and rescheduled and canceled. The medication that had been working got switched to something that didn't because of formulary changes he didn't understand. He had a bad few months that got worse, and one morning in the fall of 2017, he woke up in his room at the motel, and the money he had was enough to pay the week's rent or eat, not both. And he thought about it for a long time, and then he packed what he could carry and left the key on the bed, and walked out into the morning, and that was how it started. He's been asked since, many times, how it happens. How a man goes from being a person who has a room to being a person who doesn't. He says it's not a cliff, it's a slope. It's a long, gradual slope that you're sliding down before you understand that you're sliding. And by the time you understand, you're already somewhere you couldn't have imagined being, and the distance back looks impossible. He spent 7 years on that slope. Not continuously on the streets. There were shelters, there were temporary programs. There was a stretch of 8 months in 2019 where he had a room in a boarding house and a job washing dishes 3 nights a week, and thought he was going to make it work, and then didn't. There were people who helped along the way, and he was grateful for all of them, and none of it quite stuck. What stayed constant was Millhaven. He never left Millhaven. He couldn't have explained why. Something about the town had attached to him, or he had attached to it, the way people attach to places that aren't obviously special, for reasons that don't survive translation. He knew the town the way only homeless people know a town. Not the version of it that appears in the real estate listings or the local newspaper's best of issue. The real geography. Which shelters had beds and which ones ran out? Which restaurants left the day's leftover bread by the back door? Which churches locked their doors and which didn't? Which parking garages were watched and which weren't? Which business owners would call the police if they saw you, and which would offer a cup of coffee? He knew the park on the east side of town, off Garrison Road, the one with the small man-made pond and the walking trail, and the bench that was partially hidden from the path by a large rhododendron. He slept on that bench more nights than he could count. It was his, in the way that things belong to people who have nothing else. He knew the section of the park where the walking trail bent around a drainage ditch, where the grass grew tall and tangled in the summer, and where, on a morning in June, he found the patch. He almost walked past it. He was walking the trail early in the morning, before the dog walkers and the joggers, because the early morning was the easiest time to be in a public space, less crowded, less likely to encounter the specific energy of people who'd decided he was a problem to be managed. He was walking and not thinking about much. The morning had that quality June mornings sometimes have, cool and sharp at the edges before the heat arrives. He saw it in the grass about 4 feet from the path, a flash of color that didn't belong to anything natural. He stopped, looked at it. It was face down, which is why it took him a moment to understand what it was. He could see the back of it, the leather, a corner of stitching. He picked it up. He turned it over. He looked at it for a long time. He knew what it was. He'd seen MC patches before. In Louisiana, growing up, you saw them. He knew enough to know that this was not a small thing to find. This was not like finding a glove or a phone case. This was something that mattered deeply to someone, that had a significance he couldn't fully measure but could sense. He looked around. Nobody. Just the morning and the trail and the pond sitting flat and still in the early light. He held the patch carefully and looked at it. Iron Riders MC, it said across the top in a curved arc. Millhaven chapter. And across the nameplate, in red thread that was slightly different from the surrounding black, Bobby. And below that, in smaller letters, President. Bobby, he thought. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, against his chest, where it would stay clean and dry and safe. He didn't think about it beyond that in the moment. He just knew he wasn't going to leave it in the grass. He had no idea what he was going to do with it. He had no phone, no reliable way to search for information, no address, no starting point. What he had was the name of the club, the chapter, and the name Bobby. He asked around. This took longer than it sounds. The asking around was conducted carefully, over days, in the way that a man who has learned to be careful about his interactions with strangers conducts any inquiry. He asked at the shelter, obliquely. He asked a man he knew who had connections to various social networks in the town. He listened when people talked at the park, when they talked at the diner where he was sometimes given a meal. It took him 3 days to learn that the Iron Riders MC had a clubhouse on Route 12, south of town. It took him another week to learn something else. Something that changed the weight of what he was holding. Bobby Calloway was dead. He died in February, heart attack. He'd been 57 years old. He'd been the president of the Iron Riders for 14 years. He'd had a wife named Karen and 2 daughters, both grown, both living within 20 miles. He'd been, from what Marcus could gather from the quiet and reverent way people spoke of him, the kind of man who makes a place better by being in it. The patch had been lost at the funeral. That was what Marcus learned, piecing together half-heard conversations and careful questions. The patch had been at the funeral, and then it wasn't. Nobody knew what had happened to it. Marcus thought about this. He was sitting on his bench in the park with the patch in his inside pocket against his chest, the way it had been for most of the past week, and he thought about a man named Bobby Calloway and a funeral in February and a patch that had been lost, and he looked at the pond and thought about what it meant to lose something that was the last of something. He'd lost things. He knew what that was like. He hadn't lost them in a pond in June. He'd lost them in ways that don't have clean endings. The way you lose things in a war. The way you lose things in a life that's been coming apart for 10 years. But he knew the weight of absence. He knew what it was to reach for something and find the space where it used to be. He made a decision. It wasn't a complicated decision. It didn't require deliberation. He knew it the way he'd known certain things in the army, the things you just know when you know what you're doing and why you're doing it, and the only question is how. He was going to return the patch. He was going to take it to the Iron Riders clubhouse and give it back. That was it. That was the whole plan. He didn't think about what might happen when he got there. He didn't think about how he looked, or how he'd be received, or whether the men inside the clubhouse of a motorcycle club would have any particular reaction to a homeless veteran showing up at their door with their dead president's patch. He thought about those things a little, but not enough to stop him. He'd been in situations where the only way through was through, and this felt like one of those. It took him 4 months from finding the patch to walking to the clubhouse. This is the part that most people, hearing the story later, found hard to understand. 4 months? Why 4 months? Because in those 4 months, he was also trying to stay alive. Because finding food and finding shelter, and navigating the particular daily logistics of having nothing, takes more time and energy than people who have something can easily imagine. Because there were days when the patch was in his pocket and the clubhouse was 8 miles away, and he had 15 cents and no food, and the weather was turning, and the patch was real, but the walk felt impossibly, abstractly far. Because depression is real, and PTSD is real, and there are days when the distance between where you are and where you need to be is not measured in miles. But he kept the patch clean, through all of it. He kept it in the inside pocket of the jacket against his chest, and on the nights he was at the shelter, he asked one of the staff, a woman named Priscilla, who had been working there for 12 years, and who had seen a great many things, and who would later say that the patch was always the first thing he checked every morning, before anything else. He asked Priscilla if she had a plastic bag he could put it in to keep the moisture off it. She gave him a Ziploc bag. He said thank you. He put the patch in the bag and put the bag back in his pocket against his chest. He carried it for 4 months. And then it was October, a cold Saturday morning, and something in him said today, and he ate the breakfast the shelter served at 7, and he thanked Priscilla, and he walked. 11 miles. He counted them on a map he'd memorized from the library. Route 12 south, past the truck depot, past the storage facility, past the car lot with the American flag that snapped in the wind. And there it was, a building that had been a machine shop once, with a parking lot, and a sign that said Iron Riders MC. And on this particular Saturday morning, the parking lot was full, because the club had gathered for their monthly meeting, their first since Bobby Calloway's daughter had sent a donation to a veterans charity in his name. And they were going to talk about what to do next, about the empty chair at the table, about the patch that was still missing. Marcus walked across the parking lot. He didn't stop at the edge. He walked to the approximate center where he could be seen. He stood there. He held the patch at arm's length, slightly away from his body. And then the door opened and someone came out and saw him and stopped. And the stillness spread outward from that person like a wave, person to person, until 200 people were standing in a parking lot on an October morning, looking at a thin man in a worn jacket and a strip of duct tape on his boot, holding something they recognized. The silence happened, and nobody moved. Nobody moved for a long time. Inside the clubhouse, there was a man named Dale Fuentes, who had been vice president under Bobby Calloway for 9 years, and who had, since February, been serving as acting president in the hollow way that acting anything feels, when the person it's replacing was truly irreplaceable. Dale was 52. He'd been with the Iron Riders since he was 29. He'd met Bobby Calloway at a rest stop outside Charlotte in 1999, when they'd both pulled over in a rainstorm, and they'd talked for 2 hours under the overhang of the building. And by the time the rain stopped, Dale had known he'd found his people. He'd spoken at Bobby's funeral. He'd said things he was proud of and things he wished he'd said better. And he'd held it together because Bobby would have given him grief forever about crying at a funeral. And Dale was trying, even now, to behave in ways Bobby would not have given him grief about. He came out of the clubhouse because someone had opened the door and not come back in. He saw Marcus. He saw what Marcus was holding. His hands stopped working for a moment. He felt it literally. His hands, which had been at his sides, went still in a way that wasn't about choice, the way your body sometimes makes decisions before your mind catches up. He stood in the doorway and looked at the thin man with the patch and understood, in a pre-verbal way, what he was looking at. Not just the patch, the carrying of it. The 4-month carrying of it, which he didn't know about yet, but which he would, and which would matter more than he could currently calculate. He came down the steps. He walked through the crowd, which parted for him, because crowds always do for the person who is clearly supposed to be the one to walk through. He stopped about 3 feet from Marcus. He looked at the patch. Then he looked at Marcus's face. "Where?" he said, and then couldn't finish. "Park on Garrison Road," Marcus said. His voice was steady. He'd thought about this moment enough times that his voice was steady. "Off the trail, near the drainage ditch. I found it in June." "June," Dale said. "I wanted to make sure it got back to the right people. Took me a while to find out where to bring it." Dale looked at the patch again. Bobby's patch. The hand stitching on the border that Bobby had insisted on himself, called it tradition, called it the only way to do it properly. The name in red thread because Bobby had been the first and only president of this chapter when it was founded, and Karen had insisted on the red. "Can I?" Dale started. "It's yours," Marcus said. "That's why I'm here." Dale took the patch. He held it in both hands, looked at it for a long time. Long enough that the parking lot, already silent, became somehow more silent, a deeper register of quiet. The kind that happens when something important is happening, and everyone present understands that talking would be wrong. He pressed the patch flat between his palms and closed his eyes for just a moment. When he opened them, they were wet. He didn't try to hide it. "What's your name?" he said. "Marcus Webb." "How far did you walk, Marcus?" 11 miles, give or take." "Today?" "Today." Dale looked at him, at the jacket, the boots, the duct tape, the thinness. The particular quality of the eyes that anyone who has spent time with veterans recognizes. The exhausted hypervigilance of a person whose nervous system has been running on high alert for long enough that it can't fully come down, even now, even here, even standing in a parking lot, giving back something that cost him nothing financially and a great deal in every other way. "You served," Dale said. It wasn't a question. He could see it the way you can see things if you know what to look for. "Army, 2 tours in Iraq." Dale nodded, looked back down at the patch, then back up. "Come inside," he said. Marcus looked at the crowd. 200 people, still mostly silent, still watching. "I don't want to impose," he said. Dale looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else. "Bobby Calloway carried that patch for 14 years, he said. "He rode in weather that would have put most people inside. He showed up for people who had no claim on him. He believed fundamentally in showing up. You walked 11 miles on a Saturday morning to return something that wasn't yours and that you could have sold." He paused. "You're not imposing. You're exactly the kind of person Bobby would have insisted come inside." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I couldn't have sold it," he said. "It wasn't mine to sell." Dale looked at him. "No," he said, "it wasn't." He put his hand on Marcus's shoulder, and he led him inside. The clubhouse smelled like coffee and oil and the specific warmth of a building that has been a gathering place for a long time. that has absorbed the heat and the noise and the presence of the people who've been in it. It was crowded. The crowd was mostly outside, but inside was full too. People moving aside as Dale came through with Marcus. Conversation going quiet ahead of them. The information moving through the building faster than they were walking. There was a chair at the main table. Bobby's chair. It had been empty since February. Nobody sat in it. Not because of a rule. Nobody had made a rule. Just because. Dale sat Marcus in a different chair. A good chair, close to the center. He put Bobby's patch flat on the table in front of the empty chair. He got Marcus a coffee without asking if he wanted one, because it was obvious that he did, and that the polite performance of asking would have been its own kind of unkindness. A woman named Karen came in from the back. She was Bobby Calloway's wife. She'd come that morning because she came every month, because stopping coming would have felt like losing something else, and she'd already lost enough. She was 60 years old and had been married to Bobby for 31 years, and she was simultaneously the most composed person in most rooms she entered, and the person who had been quietly falling apart every day for 8 months in ways only Dorothy, her sister, fully understood. She saw the patch on the table before anyone told her. She crossed the room. She stood in front of it for a moment. Then she looked at Marcus. He was watching her, the way he watched things, carefully, taking inventory. He'd stood up when she came in. He didn't know why exactly. Instinct, something his mother had taught him before he could remember being taught it. "You found this," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "In the park?" "Yes, ma'am, Garrison Road." She looked at him for a long moment. "Do you know what a back patch means?" she asked. "To an MC, do you know what it is?" "I know it matters," Marcus said. "I don't know all the reasons why. I know it was his, and I know he was gone, and I figured it should be with the people who knew those reasons." Karen reached out and touched the edge of the patch, just the edge, the way you touch something you're not sure you're allowed to touch. Then she looked at Marcus again, at all of him, and her face did something that was not crying, exactly, but was in the same country. "How long did you carry it?" she said. "About 4 months." She absorbed that. 4 months. "I had to figure out where to bring it. You could have mailed it." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I didn't think mailing it was right," he said. "Something like this needs to be handed over." Karen looked at him for a long time, long enough that the room was very still again. Then she sat down across from him, and she started to talk. She talked about Bobby, not the formal obituary version, not the eulogy version, the real version, the one she carried around inside her every day. She told Marcus about the man who had joined this club at 32 because a friend dragged him to a meeting, and he'd sat in the back and said almost nothing, and come home and told Karen he'd found something, and she'd said, "What?" And he'd said, "People, I think." And she'd said, "Bobby, that's not a sentence." And he'd said, "No, but it's an answer." She told him about the afternoon 2 years ago, when Bobby had sat at the kitchen table, and she'd found him reading something on his laptop, and she'd looked over his shoulder, and it had been an article about veteran homelessness rates in North Carolina. And she'd asked what he was doing, and he'd said trying to understand something, and she'd asked what, and he'd said why we're so bad at it, why we can't take care of the people we send to do the things we don't want to do ourselves. The room was very quiet. Marcus's coffee was getting cold in front of him, and he hadn't drunk much of it. Karen looked at him. "He was working on something," she said. "Before he died, he was trying to set up a program, through the club, for veterans in the area who needed housing support. He had notes. He had contacts. He had one meeting with a VA liaison in January, and then in February." She stopped. Nobody finished the sentence. "The notes are still at home," she said, "on his laptop." "I couldn't," she looked at the patch on the table. "I couldn't figure out what to do with them." Marcus said nothing. Dale was sitting 3 seats down, watching. He was listening to something that hadn't been said, the way you listen to something that's being decided while the conversation happens around it. He had the same feeling he'd had in the parking lot, the pre-verbal feeling, the one that arrives before the thought. Something was being arranged here that none of them had arranged. He didn't have a religious framework for it exactly, but he had a framework, the kind you develop when you've been alive long enough and paying attention. When you understand that some things happen in the way that things happen when they're supposed to happen. A man spent 4 months carrying a patch through the hard logistics of having nothing. He walked 11 miles on a Saturday morning to return it. And the thing he returned it to was a woman who had her husband's unfinished work sitting on a laptop at home and didn't know what to do with it. Dale picked up his phone. He texted the group chat. The text said, "Nobody leaves. We need to talk." Outside, in the parking lot, the crowd read the text. They weren't leaving anyway. What happened in the next 3 hours was not organized in any formal sense. It organized itself, which is sometimes the best kind of organizing. Karen brought out Bobby's laptop. She'd been carrying it in her bag since morning without knowing why. She'd put it in before she left home and hadn't examined the impulse. She opened the folder of notes. Bobby had been thorough. He'd been a mechanic by trade and a methodical thinker by nature, which meant his notes were detailed and practical and covered things like budget sources, potential partner organizations, a phased approach starting with emergency housing assistance and moving toward transitional support. A list of VA liaisons he'd already spoken to. A woman named Sandra, who had been with the Iron Riders for 6 years and worked as a social worker at the county health department, read through the notes and looked up after 20 minutes. "This is good," she said. "This is actually really good. He'd done the work." "He always did the work," Karen said. "I mean, I can take this to my supervisor Monday. I can find out what we need to make this a real partnership." Nobody said anything for a moment. "Bobby," Dale said to the table, and then just, "Yeah." Marcus had been sitting through this. He'd been given more coffee and a plate of food that someone had produced from somewhere without fanfare, put in front of him without comment, which he'd eaten slowly and with the specific careful attention of a man who doesn't always know when the next meal is coming. He'd been listening. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. He'd done the thing he came to do. He'd returned the patch. The natural next move was to leave, to stand up and say thank you for the coffee and walk the 11 miles back, and that would be the end of it. He'd done a good thing. He could carry that. He was trying to figure out the right moment to stand up. Dale saw this. He'd been watching Marcus the way he watched things that mattered. "Where are you sleeping tonight?" he said. Marcus looked at him. "Depends on the shelter." "Depends on the shelter. Sometimes there's space, sometimes." "How long?" Dale said. "How long has this been your situation?" Marcus considered this. It was a question people sometimes asked in a way that wasn't really a question, that was a prelude to something uncomfortable. He didn't read that in Dale's face. He read it as someone who actually wanted to know. 7 years, he said, on and off, more on lately. Dale was quiet. "Iraq?" he said. 2 tours, 2003 to 04, 05 to 06. "Did you get the help you needed when you came back?" Marcus looked at his coffee. "I got some help. Not the right kind. Not in time." Dale nodded. He'd heard versions of this before. Most of them had. Several of the men in the club were veterans themselves. They understood, in their bones, the gap between what the country says it will do for the people it sends to war and what it actually does. There was a man named Hector sitting at the end of the table. Hector ran a small construction company, 3 full-time employees, work spread across residential repairs and small commercial jobs in a 40-mile radius. He'd been a Marine. He'd joined the Iron Riders in 2011, and he'd been one of Bobby's closest friends. And he'd been sitting quietly since Marcus walked in, listening to everything. He looked at Dale. Dale looked at him. Something passed between them that didn't require words. The kind of communication that happens between people who have known each other long enough that the language is compressed. "Marcus," Hector said. Marcus looked at him. "Can you swing a hammer?" Marcus blinked. "I can do most things with most tools." "You have any construction experience?" "Some. Labor mostly. Some framing. I worked a site here in Millhaven for about 8 months back in 15. Hector looked at Dale again. "I've got a project starting Monday," he said to Marcus. "Week of demo and framing. I could use another set of hands." pays 15 an hour, 8 to 5, cash at the end of each day. He paused. I also have a room above my garage. My wife has been on me to rent it, and I've been too lazy to deal with it. It's nothing fancy. It's got a bed and a bathroom and a space heater. Marcus was very still. What would you want for it? He said. $400 a month, which at 15 an hour you can cover in less than 2 weeks. Marcus looked at him. Why are you doing this? Hector didn't look away. Because Bobby Calloway spent 14 years showing up for people who had no claim on him, he said. And because you walked 11 miles on a Saturday morning to return something that cost you nothing financially and a great deal in every other way. And because I'm tired of watching what happens to the men who went where we sent them. So, he spread his hands. Can you start Monday? The room was quiet. Marcus looked at Hector. He looked at Dale. He looked at Karen, who was watching him with Bobby's laptop open in front of her and Bobby's patch on the table beside it. He thought about 7 years. He thought about the slope. He thought about the bench on Garrison Road where the rhododendron blocked the path, where he'd been sleeping when the weather was right, 20 feet from where he'd found the patch. He thought about what it meant to find something someone lost, and what it meant to carry it for 4 months, and what it meant to walk 11 miles in October to return it. He thought about the moment in the parking lot when 200 people went silent. Yes, he said, I can start Monday. Hector nodded. Then it settled. It was not a big moment in its surface texture. 2 people talking at a table. But the room felt it the way rooms feel things, the way certain moments have a quality that everyone present recognizes, a specific gravity, and you know you'll think about it later, and you do. Now pay attention, because this is the part that matters most, and it didn't happen in the clubhouse, and it didn't happen on Monday, and it didn't happen in any place with a name. It happened in increments, in the small accumulating movements of a life that was trying to reform itself, in the particular, fragile daily work of a man who was starting over at 43, with a room above a garage and a construction job and 7 years of ground to make back up. Hector was a good employer. This mattered. Not all employers are good employers, and Marcus had worked for enough bad ones to know the difference. Hector was precise about expectations and fair about everything else. He showed up on time and expected you to show up on time, and when you did, he left you alone to do the work. He didn't talk too much, which Marcus needed, because too much talking in tight spaces had a tendency to make his nervous system treat the tight space as something it wasn't. Hector's wife, Maria, knocked on the door of the garage apartment on Marcus's 3rd evening with a plate of food and set it down on the small table inside the door without being asked to come in. I made too much, she said. She said this for approximately 6 weeks before stopping saying it, because at some point it stopped needing to be said. Sandra, the social worker, made a call on Monday. She made several calls. By Wednesday, she had a meeting with a VA liaison that Bobby Calloway had already met with in January, a meeting that might have happened in March if Bobby had still been alive and now was happening in November instead. The notes on the laptop were comprehensive. Bobby had done the work. By December, the Iron Riders MC had formally partnered with the County Health Department on a veteran housing assistance program. It was not, in December, a large program. It had a budget that Sandra described as modest, and Dale described as a start, and which Karen described, privately to her sister Dorothy, as exactly the amount Bobby thought they'd begin with. It had a name. They called it Bobby's House, which was not Bobby's name for it because he hadn't gotten that far. But it was the name that the group landed on without much debate, the way the right name tends to arrive without requiring a vote. In its first 3 months, Bobby's House placed 4 veterans in transitional housing. 4 veterans who had been where Marcus had been, on the slope, losing ground, not finding the right help in time. 4 people who were somewhere different by spring than they'd been in winter. Marcus was the 5th, or the 1st, depending on how you count it. He'd found his own housing, through Hector, before the program had a formal structure. But he was the reason the structure had been built, which is its own kind of being first. He'd been in the garage apartment for 2 months when Sandra told him what she was working on. He was quiet for a moment. Bobby was working on this before he died, he said. Yes. And I brought back his patch. Yes. And now? Yes, Sandra said. That's how it connected. He was quiet for a while longer. Then, I walked past that park 100 times, he said. Garrison Road. That bench is where I sleep when the weather's right. I walked past that drainage ditch 100 times. And then one day you didn't walk past. And then one day I didn't walk past, he agreed. He thought about that. He thought about the randomness of it, the specific randomness of a patch being in the grass off a trail in a park, and a man who needed something to hold walking past it early enough in the morning that nobody else had found it first. He thought about what Karen had said about Bobby's notes, about the VA liaison meeting in January, about the February that ended everything and the October that started something else. He wasn't sure what he believed about the shape of things. He'd been sure about things once, in Iraq, and the certainty had come apart in ways that left him reluctant to reassemble it. But he thought about the patch in his inside pocket against his chest for 4 months, and the bench 20 feet from where he'd found it, and the woman with the laptop and the notes, and Dale saying nobody leaves, and Hector asking, can you swing a hammer? He didn't have a word for it. He had a feeling. The feeling was something like, this was always going to happen. Not in a way that took the choice out of it. He'd had to choose to pick it up. He'd had to choose to keep it clean. He'd had to choose to walk 11 miles on a Saturday morning when staying on the bench would have been easier and warmer and less uncertain. The choices were real, but underneath the choices, something that felt like intention. Not his intention, something larger. He kept this to himself mostly. He wasn't much of a talker about the things that mattered to him. This was something he was working on, with a counselor he'd started seeing through a program Sandra had connected him to. A man named Dr. Osei, who was patient and specific, and who had asked Marcus in their 4th session what he was proud of. Marcus had thought about this for a long time. I kept it clean, he said. Dr. Osei looked at him. The patch. For 4 months, I kept it clean. Dr. Osei wrote something down. Tell me why that matters to you, he said. Marcus thought about it. Because it wasn't mine, he said. And taking care of something that isn't yours, when you don't have to, when there's no benefit to you, that's the thing. That's the whole thing, I think. That's the whole lesson. Dr. Osei looked at him. Where did you learn that? He said. Marcus thought about the army, about the men beside him, about his mother, Gloria, who had worked dispatch for a trucking company and come home and made dinner for 4 kids every night. About a tent in Fallujah in 2004, where a man named Reyes, who was from New Mexico, and who had died 6 months later, and who Marcus thought about on a specific frequency that hadn't decreased in 20 years, had sat across from him and said, Marcus, I swear to God, you are the most stubborn man in 3 countries, and I mean that with complete respect. I don't know, he said, from all of it. Everything. That's an answer, Dr. Osei said. Spring came to Millhaven the way springs do, sudden and unearned, cold one week and warm the next, and the dogwoods showing off on the main road and the birds back at the feeders. Marcus had been in Hector's garage apartment for 5 months. He'd worked through the winter, steadily, showing up on time, doing the work. Hector had given him more responsibility in the 3rd month, had him supervising a 2-man crew on a job in town, and Marcus had done it the way he'd done his NCO work, precisely, fairly, demanding without cruelty. The 2-man crew told Hector he was good. Hector told Marcus. Marcus said thank you and didn't say anything else, but something in his posture was slightly different for a few days. He started going to the VA regularly, which he hadn't done in years, because the process had defeated him before, and because Sandra had identified a new liaison and smoothed the path enough that the process didn't feel like running into the same wall repeatedly. The medication took 3 adjustments before it was right. He was honest about this with Dr. Osei, about the adjustments, about the days between adjustments that were hard, about the specific nature of hard. He went to the park sometimes in the morning. He walked the trail. He walked past the drainage ditch. He stood at the bench and looked at it without sitting down, which felt important for reasons he didn't try to analyze. One Saturday in April, he went to the Iron Riders' monthly gathering. Karen had called him the week before. Not asked exactly, offered. Said there'd be food, said Dale wanted to see how he was doing, said it was nothing formal. He'd said he'd think about it. She'd said okay. He'd called back 2 days later and said yes. He didn't know what to expect. What he found was people. Just people. The parking lot looked different in April than it had in October. Warmer, louder, more movement. The same chrome and leather and loud engines, but softened somehow by the season, by the light. He stood at the edge of the lot for a moment, the way he'd stood there in October, and then Dale saw him and came over and said, "Good, you're here, come on." He met Bobby's daughters, both of them. Rachel, who was 33 and taught middle school and looked like Bobby according to Karen, and Jolie, who was 30 and worked for a nonprofit in Raleigh and had the same eyes as her father and the same way of listening, very still, giving nothing away, and then saying exactly the right thing. Rachel said, "Mom told me what you did. You carried it for 4 months." "Yes," Marcus said. "In your pocket." "Inside pocket, against my chest." She looked at him. "Why did you keep it so close?" He thought about this. "Because it was important," he said. "Important things should be kept close." She was quiet for a moment. "My dad would have said that," she said. They ate together, at a long table that someone had set up outside in the April warmth. Marcus sat between Hector and a man named Liam who had been in the Navy in the 80s and who wanted to talk about the difference between Army and Navy, which turned into a specific and mutually satisfying argument that both of them seemed to enjoy. The food was good. The noise was loud, but manageable. He'd told Dale coming in that he sometimes needed to step outside if it got to be too much. And Dale had said, "Of course," and then added that the side door opened to a quiet area behind the building, which Marcus appreciated, not because he needed it today, but because knowing it was there made the inside feel more possible. After the food, Karen came to sit beside him. She was holding something. "I want you to have this," she said. She put it on the table. It was a small pin. An Iron Riders pin, the club logo. Not a patch. He wasn't a member. He hadn't earned a patch. That wasn't what this was. Just a pin. Small enough to fit on a jacket lapel. Bobby gave these to people who... She stopped. He gave them to people who reminded him why he was doing it, who reminded him what the point was. She looked at the pin. He had a box of them. I still have the box. I've been thinking about who to give them to, and I can't think of anyone who deserves the first one more than you. Marcus looked at the pin. He picked it up. It was light, small, a piece of metal the size of a quarter. He thought about what it cost him to carry the patch, which was nothing financially, which was nothing in most ways, which was everything in the specific way that doing a thing right when you don't have to do it at all is everything. "Thank you," he said. He pinned it to his jacket lapel. He wore it out of the parking lot that afternoon. He was wearing it on Monday when he showed up to work. Hector looked at it, said nothing, but nodded in a way that covered a lot of ground. Here's what happened with Bobby's house. By the end of its first year, the program had placed 11 veterans in transitional housing arrangements in the county. 11 people in different places than they'd been. The program had a small staff now. Sandra was the coordinator, part-time, because her full-time job was still her full-time job. There was a volunteer coordinator named Pat who had retired from the post office and had time and organizational skills that he applied to the program with the specific satisfaction of someone who has found the right use for their abilities. They presented the year-end numbers at the Iron Riders December gathering. Dale put them up on a dry erase board, 11 placements. 142 people served in some capacity through the broader support network. 3 partnerships with other county organizations that hadn't existed a year ago. He wrote the numbers and then he stepped back and looked at them. "Bobby did this," he said. "He did the work. He built the architecture of this while none of us knew he was doing it. He was carrying this the way he always carried things." He paused. And the man named Marcus Webb carried something of Bobby's for 4 months, through conditions none of us would want to imagine, because he knew it belonged somewhere and he was going to get it there. And the thing he carried led us here. He looked at the board. I don't know what you call that. I'm not going to try to put a name on it, but I'm going to write the numbers down every year, and I'm going to remember where they started. He wrote the date at the top of the board. October, a parking lot, 200 people. Silence. The silence that happens when something important arrives in a form you weren't expecting. Marcus is not a big talker about his own story. He doesn't go out of his way to tell it. He'll tell it if he's asked, carefully and without embellishment, the way he tells most things. Straight, in sequence, with the important parts in the right places. He's still working for Hector. He got a raise in January. He's been taking some classes at the community college 2 evenings a week, construction management, because Hector suggested it and because Marcus found, when he sat down in the first class, that the thing he'd felt about the Army's clarity had been about that. He was good in situations that had structure and specificity and room for precision. The classroom felt like that. He's good at it. The VA stuff is better. Not perfect. He'd tell you it's not perfect and probably never will be completely. Because what the war did to him is not the kind of thing that gets undone, only the kind of thing that gets managed, worked with, integrated. But better. Reliably better. Which is its own kind of progress. He still walks in the park on Garrison Road sometimes. He walks past the bench. He walks past the drainage ditch. He found the patch in June. He returned it in October. In between those months, he kept it clean. He kept it close. He got it where it needed to go. He didn't do it for anything. He did it because it was the right thing to do, which is a reason that has gone out of fashion in some quarters and has never gone out of fashion in the places that matter. He did it because the thing belonged somewhere and he was going to get it there, and because someone had lost something and deserved to have it back, and because that is the law of certain things, as obvious and inevitable as gravity, that you return what you find, that you carry what needs carrying, that you go where the thing requires you to go. He walked 11 miles on a cold Saturday morning. He held something carefully in both hands. 200 people went silent, and in the silence, something that had been broken began, in its particular way, with its particular speed, to come back together. What stays with you about all of it, if you sit with it long enough, is the carrying, not the return, not the silence in the parking lot, which was extraordinary, not the conversation with Karen, not Hector's offer, not Sandra's calls, not the numbers on the dry erase board in December. The carrying. 4 months, Ziploc bag, inside pocket against his chest, first thing checked every morning. There was no audience for those 4 months, nobody watching, nobody applauding, no one who would have known the difference if he'd sold it, or thrown it away, or just left it in the grass where he found it, which would have been easier and simpler and would have cost him nothing. The carrying happened in the absence of any incentive to carry, in the presence of every incentive not to. He had almost nothing, and he kept something precious clean and close for 4 months because it belonged to someone and deserved to get home. That's the part that bikers who were in that parking lot still talk about. Not how many of them were there, not the silence. They talk about the 4 months. They talk about it when they're trying to say something about what character is, about what it looks like when it's real, when it's not performed for anyone, when the only audience is yourself and whatever you believe in, and the cold morning, and the trail, and the drainage ditch, and the bench where you sleep. They talk about it when they're trying to say something about Bobby Calloway too, about what it means that the man who had been trying to build something for veterans died before he could finish it, and that the person who found his patch and walked 11 miles in October to return it was the exact person the thing was being built for. That the return of the patch led to the notes on the laptop, which led to the meeting with the VA liaison, which led to Bobby's house. That the missing piece found its way home and unlocked everything Bobby had been building. They can't quite explain it. They've stopped trying. Some things explain themselves better through living in them than through talking about them, and they've learned to let those things live. Dale keeps the patch in a case on the wall of the clubhouse. Underneath it, a small card in Karen's handwriting. For Bobby, who always did the work, and for Marcus, who kept it clean. Karen still comes every month. Bobby's daughters come when they can. Bobby's house is still running, larger now. The numbers go up every year, and Dale writes them on the board in December and looks at them for a while before he says anything. Marcus went to the second-year presentation. He sat in the back and listened to the numbers and didn't say anything, which was his preference. On the way out, Karen stopped him. "Do you know what Bobby would have said?" she asked. He waited. He would have said, "We're just getting started." She paused. That was his thing. Whenever things were going well, whenever there was something to celebrate, he'd say it. "We're just getting started." Drove Dale crazy because Dale is a finisher and Bobby was always starting something new. Marcus thought about that. "He sounds like good trouble," he said. Karen laughed. It was the real laugh, not the composed one. "He was the best possible trouble," she said, "every single day." They stood in the parking lot for a moment, in the evening light, the spring version of the evening, warm and extended, the parking lot busy and loud around them. "Thank you," Marcus said. For what specifically he didn't say. For all of it. "No," Karen said. "Thank you." She said it the way you say something when you mean it all the way through, when the word is carrying more than its face value, when it's standing in for something that doesn't have a word. He drove home in the truck he'd bought in February. Used, runs fine. Harold would have approved. He drove past the park on Garrison Road. He didn't stop. He drove home. He went inside, made coffee, sat at the table. The Iron Rider's pin was on his jacket on the hook by the door. He could see it from where he sat, small and silver and catching the light. He sat with his coffee and thought about carrying things, about what it means to pick something up, about what it costs and what it gives, and why those two numbers never balance the way you expect. About the bench 20 feet from where he found the patch, and the 4 months, and the 11 miles, and the silence. He thought, I was always going to walk there. I just needed to find the right thing to carry. He finished his coffee. He went to bed. He slept well. If this story found you at the right moment, and stories have a way of finding you when they're supposed to, share it. Not because someone told you to, because somewhere there's a man who walked 11 miles with something precious in his pocket and didn't know yet what it would unlock. And somewhere there's something in the grass that's waiting to be picked up by the right person. And somewhere there's a woman with a laptop full of unfinished work that needs someone to walk through the door and make it real. The world has more of this than we remember, and the only way to remember is to keep the stories moving. There's more waiting for you on this channel. Stories about the weight of what we carry and what we put down. About the people who show up when showing up is hard. About the way grace moves through the world in forms we don't expect. One of them is right there when this ends. Don't go far. Let me tell you something about Bobby Calloway that you need to know, because this story is his as much as it's Marcus's, and you only understand Marcus fully when you understand what he walked into. Bobby Calloway grew up in the same county he died in. Millhaven born, Millhaven raised. Left once at 22 for 4 years in Charlotte, working at a machine shop there, and came back because coming back was what people from places like Millhaven did, and because he'd been honest with himself about what Charlotte was to him. A test he'd passed, not a life he wanted. He was the kind of man who was fully himself in every room he entered. Not loud. Bobby was not loud, but present. There's a specific quality that certain people have where their presence fills space in a way that isn't about volume or size, where people turn toward them without being able to say why, where conversations they're part of go better than conversations they're not. Bobby had this. His daughters had tried to explain it at various points in their lives and had always ended up in the same place. He paid attention. He actually paid attention to you, to whatever you were saying, to the thing beneath the thing you were saying. And the experience of being paid attention to by someone who genuinely means it is rarer and more affecting than most people realize. He'd started the Millhaven chapter of the Iron Riders with 4 other men in 2009. He'd been 43 years old. He'd been riding since he was 25, had ridden with other groups and clubs, an informal gathering of people who liked to ride, and had finally sat down with 4 men he trusted and said, "I want to build something that lasts, and that does something." And here's what I mean by both of those words. What he meant by lasts: a culture, not just a club. The difference being that a club has members, and a culture has people who believe in something, and belief is stickier than membership. He wanted people who showed up because they wanted to, not because they had to. He wanted the kind of organization that, when it gathered, did something with its gathering rather than just being gathered. What he meant by does something, he was imprecise about this, which is unusual for Bobby. But it was an early-stage imprecision, the kind you have before the specifics arrive. He knew the direction. He'd grown up watching the county deal with problems: veteran poverty, housing instability, people falling through gaps in systems that were supposed to catch them. And he'd spent most of his adult life with a low-grade anger about the gap between what was supposed to happen and what did. He wanted the club to be something that closed gaps. He wasn't sure yet which gaps, specifically. He wanted to find out. 14 years later, when his heart stopped on a Tuesday in February, the Iron Riders had raised more than $300,000 for local causes, had built 7 wheelchair ramps for veterans in the county, had run a food pantry out of the clubhouse every 3rd Saturday for 5 years, had connected more than 60 families with support services they hadn't known they could access. He'd been working on the housing program for 2 years. Quietly, methodically, the way he worked on everything. The notes on the laptop were thorough. The contacts were real. The VA liaison he'd met in January had come away from that meeting thinking, "This man is going to make this happen," which was not a thought she had often, because most people who came to her with plans were well-meaning and disorganized, and she spent a lot of meetings gently redirecting energy that was going nowhere. He hadn't told most of the club what he was building. Not because he was secretive. He wasn't secretive, not really, but because he didn't want to launch anything until he knew it could land. He'd started several things in his life that hadn't landed, early enthusiasm that dissolved when the detail work arrived, and he'd learned from that. Don't tell people what you're going to do, show them what you've done. He told Karen. He told Dale in a general way in November. He said, "I've been working on something." Dale had said, "What?" Bobby had said, "Something for veterans. Something real, not just a ride or a fundraiser, something structural." Dale had said, "When do I hear about it?" Bobby had said, "When it's ready." It was almost ready when he died. Karen found the folder on the laptop 2 weeks after the funeral, going through his files for the insurance paperwork, and she'd sat at the kitchen table for a long time looking at it. Looking at the neat, detailed, specific notes of a man who had known exactly what he was doing and had not finished doing it,